September 17, 1980, 14:30 hours. Strategic Air Command Headquarters, Offutt Air Force Base, Nebraska. Colonel Richard V. Reynolds reviewed the latest safety assessment report for the Titan II ICBM program. The document, compiled by the Air Force Safety Center, covered 18 years of operations across 54 missile complexes in 3 states, Arkansas, Kansas, and Arizona. Reynolds highlighted a passage on page 12. The Titan II weapon system has maintained an exemplary safety record. In 6,870 operational days per complex, totaling 354,180 complex days of operation, no catastrophic failure resulting in weapon loss or yield has occurred. Statistical analysis projects the probability of major accident at less than 0.001% per operational year. He initialed the report and passed it to his aide. Excellent numbers. The Titan II remains our most reliable deterrent. Send copies to all complex commanders. NIDE. What Colonel Reynolds did not know, what no statistical analysis could predict, was that 24 hours later, at Complex 374-7 near Damascus, Arkansas, an Air Force technician named David Powell would drop an 8-pound socket wrench while performing routine maintenance. The wrench would fall 70 feet down the silo, puncture the missile's fuel tank, and initiate a 9-hour countdown to an explosion that would launch a 9-megaton nuclear warhead 600 feet into the air. The wrench cost $47.50. The missile it destroyed cost $31 million. The nuclear warhead that nearly detonated had a yield 600 times greater than Hiroshima, and the accident that began with one dropped tool came within safety margins so thin that investigators would later describe it as the most dangerous broken arrow incident in American history. September 18, 1980, would prove that no safety record, no statistical analysis, no confidence in procedures could eliminate the fundamental vulnerability of nuclear weapon systems: human error, mechanical failure, and catastrophic consequences measured in megatons. To understand how an 8-pound wrench nearly vaporized half of Arkansas, one must understand the Titan II missile system, the most powerful ICBM ever deployed by the United States, and the most dangerous weapon to handle in the American nuclear arsenal. The Titan II program began in 1960 as the second generation of American intercontinental ballistic missiles. The Titan I, deployed from 1959 to 1965, used liquid oxygen and RP-1 kerosene as propellants, requiring the missiles to be fueled before launch, a process taking 15 minutes. In a surprise attack scenario, 15 minutes might not be available. The Titan II solved this problem by using hypergolic propellants, fuels that ignite on contact with each other, requiring no ignition system. The missile could be stored fully fueled and ready to launch within 58 seconds of receiving launch orders. This rapid response capability made the Titan II a critical component of America's nuclear deterrent through the 1960s and 1970s. Between 1963 and 1965, the Air Force activated 54 Titan II complexes, 18 around Tucson, Arizona, 18 around Wichita, Kansas, and 18 around Little Rock, Arkansas. Each complex consisted of a silo housing a single missile, a launch control center buried 35 feet underground, and surface support facilities. The missile itself was enormous, 103 feet tall, 10 feet in diameter, weighing 330,000 pounds fully fueled. It stood in its silo like a giant metal cylinder, pointing at the sky through a 740-ton sliding door that would open in seconds during a launch sequence. At the top of the missile sat the payload, a W-53 thermonuclear warhead with a yield of 9 megatons. To put this in perspective, the bomb dropped on Hiroshima yielded 15 kilotons. The W-53 was 600 times more powerful. A single Titan II could destroy any city on Earth and kill millions of people. The Titan II's range exceeded 9,300 miles, sufficient to reach any target in the Soviet Union from silos in the continental United States. The missile's accuracy was impressive for its era, a circular error probable of 1.1 nautical miles, meaning half of all warheads would impact within 1.1 miles of their aim point. Given the 9-megaton yield, this accuracy was more than sufficient to destroy hardened Soviet military targets. By 1980, 54 Titan II missiles stood on alert, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Each silo was manned by a 2-person crew working 24-hour shifts in the underground launch control center. The crews could launch their missile within 1 minute of receiving authenticated orders from Strategic Air Command. But the Titan II had a significant vulnerability that distinguished it from later solid-fuel missiles like the Minuteman. Its hypergolic propellants were extraordinarily dangerous. The Titan II used 2 propellants, Aerozine 50 as fuel and nitrogen tetroxide, N2O4, as oxidizer. Aerozine 50 is a mixture of hydrazine and unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine. Nitrogen tetroxide is a highly corrosive, toxic gas that turns into nitric acid when it contacts moisture, including the moisture in human lungs. These propellants are called hypergolic because they ignite spontaneously when they contact each other. No spark is needed, no ignition system is required, just contact and you get combustion. This property made the Titan II a rapid response weapon. It also made it a death trap for anyone working near a leak. The missile carried 150,000 pounds of Aerozine 50 in its first-stage fuel tank and 164,000 pounds of nitrogen tetroxide in its first-stage oxidizer tank. A second stage contained additional propellant. The missile was, essentially, a giant bomb sitting in a hole in the ground, held in check by fuel tank walls made of aluminum alloy 0.4 inches thick. Nitrogen tetroxide vapor is toxic at concentrations as low as 5 parts per million. At 25 ppm, it causes severe respiratory distress. At 50 ppm, it can be fatal within hours. And N2O4 is heavier than air, so it sinks, filling low spaces like missile silos, making escape difficult if you're working at the bottom of a 150-foot hole. By 1980, the Titan II program had experienced numerous oxidizer leaks. The corrosive nature of N2O4 meant that seals, gaskets, and tank walls gradually degraded. Maintenance was constant. Leak detection was critical. Procedures for handling oxidizer leaks filled hundreds of pages of technical manuals. But on September 18, 1980, the leak at Complex 3747 would not be a slow seep from a degraded seal. It would be a catastrophic rupture caused by an 8-pound socket wrench puncturing the first-stage fuel tank. Complex 3747 was located approximately 50 miles north of Little Rock, near the small town of Damascus, Arkansas. Population 382. The silo sat in farmland, surrounded by rolling hills and forests. The nearest major city, Little Rock, with a population of 180,000, was close enough to be vaporized if the warhead detonated. The complex had been operational since April 1963. For 17 years, the missile had stood on alert without major incident. Routine maintenance occurred regularly. The crew rotations proceeded normally. It was one of the safest, most reliable complexes in the Titan II program. On September 18, 1980, a routine maintenance procedure was scheduled. The task was to replace the pressure regulator on the first-stage oxidizer tank. This was a standard operation, performed hundreds of times across all 54 complexes. The procedure was documented in Technical Order 21M LGM 25C212, a maintenance manual that specified every step in precise detail. The maintenance team consisted of 2 propellant transfer system PTS specialists, Senior Airman David F. Powell, 21 years old, and Airman Jeffrey L. Plum, 19 years old. Both men were trained and certified for this work. Powell had performed this specific procedure twice before. Plum was less experienced but was working under Powell's supervision. The procedure required the team to descend to level 2 of the silo, approximately 70 feet below ground level, and work on the oxidizer tank. They would use a large socket wrench with a 3-foot extension to remove and replace the pressure regulator. The socket itself weighed 8 pounds, a solid steel tool designed for high-torque applications. At 18:30 hours, Powell and Plum entered the silo. They climbed down the metal stairway that spiraled around the missile, descending past level 1, past the warhead, past the second stage, down to level 2, where the first stage oxidizer tank was located. The workspace was cramped. The missile filled most of the silo's diameter. The work platform was a narrow metal grating surrounding the missile. Powell and Plum wore protective gear, coveralls, gloves, and self-contained breathing apparatus in case of oxidizer leaks. At 18:45 hours, Powell positioned himself at the work site. The pressure regulator was located on the side of the oxidizer tank, accessible through a small opening in the missile's skin. Powell would have to reach into the confined space with the socket wrench to remove the regulator. Plum stood several feet away, holding a flashlight and providing assistance as needed. The Launch Control Center crew, located in the underground bunker 200 feet from the silo, monitored their progress via radio. At 18:51 hours, Powell inserted the socket wrench into the workspace and positioned it on the pressure regulator. He applied torque, beginning to loosen the fitting. The work was proceeding normally. What happened in the next 3 seconds would be reconstructed from Powell's account and physical evidence, but the exact sequence remains debated. What is certain is that at 18:52 hours, the socket wrench slipped from Powell's hand. Powell later stated that the socket came loose from the torque wrench extension. The connection, a 3-4-inch drive fitting, had separated. Others suggested Powell had dropped the entire assembly. The investigation could not definitively determine which account was accurate. What mattered was the result. An 8-pound steel socket fell 70 feet down the silo, accelerating under gravity, reaching a terminal velocity of approximately 50 feet per second before it struck the first-stage fuel tank. The socket hit the aluminum alloy tank wall at an oblique angle. The impact energy, concentrated on the socket's edge, exceeded the tank's penetration resistance. The socket punched through the 0.4-inch thick aluminum, creating a hole approximately 2 inches in diameter. Airman 50 began spraying from the puncture at high pressure. The missile's fuel tanks were pressurized to 55 psi to enable rapid propellant flow during launch. With a 2-inch hole, fuel was escaping at approximately 400 gallons per minute. Powell saw the spray immediately. "We've got a leak," he shouted into his radio. "Fuel is spraying from the first stage tank." "We're evacuating now." At 18:52:15, approximately 15 seconds after the socket fell, Powell and Plum were climbing the stairs, ascending as fast as their protective gear allowed. Behind them, Airman 50 continued spraying from the punctured tank, filling the lower levels of the silo with toxic vapor. At 18:53 hours, Powell and Plum reached the surface. They had evacuated in 45 seconds, moving with trained efficiency despite the terror of knowing they were in a silo filling with explosive toxic fuel. In the Launch Control Center, Deputy Commander First Lieutenant Michael M. Mazzaro received Powell's report and immediately activated emergency procedures. He notified Strategic Air Command that Complex 374-7 had a major propellant leak and the site was being evacuated. At 18:55 hours, Mazzaro and his commander, Captain Morris L. K., evacuated the Launch Control Center. The bunker, while designed to withstand a nuclear blast, offered no protection against toxic vapor that could infiltrate through the ventilation system. By 1900 hours, all personnel had evacuated the complex. They established a command post 2,000 feet from the silo, far enough to be safe from vapor, but close enough to monitor the situation. The leak continued. Airman 50 poured from the punctured tank, pooling at the bottom of the silo. The fuel was not igniting because there was no oxidizer present in the spray, no source of ignition, but the fuel was evaporating, creating a flammable vapor-air mixture that filled the silo. The critical question facing Air Force commanders was, what do we do now? The response to the Damascus accident involved multiple layers of command, from the on-site personnel to Strategic Air Command headquarters in Omaha to the Pentagon in Washington. By 19:30 hours, less than an hour after the socket fell, senior Air Force leadership was briefing the Joint Chiefs of Staff on the situation. The options were limited, and all were dangerous. Option 1. Do nothing. Let the fuel drain completely. The tank contained 150,000 pounds of Airman 50. At 400 gallons per minute, complete drainage would take approximately 6 hours, but doing nothing meant toxic vapor would continue accumulating. The slightest spark, the slightest ignition source, could cause an explosion. Option 2, inject foam into the silo to suppress the vapor. The Air Force had foam designed for this purpose, but injecting foam into an enclosed space filled with fuel vapor might create static electricity, which could ignite the vapor. Option 3, spray water into the silo to dilute the vapor. But water reacting with residual oxidizer could create additional toxic gases. And again, the introduction of water might create static sparks. Option 4, evacuate the warhead. Remove the 9-megaton W-53 from the top of the missile, eliminating the nuclear threat. But accessing the warhead meant entering the silo, climbing 100 feet up the missile, while fuel vapor filled the space below. One spark from a tool, one ignition source, and the vapor would explode with the crew members inside. Option 5, wait for specialized response teams. The Air Force had a disaster response force trained for exactly this scenario, but they were based at Hill Air Force Base in Utah, 300 miles away. They would not arrive for at least 12 hours. At 2,000 hours, the disaster response force was activated and began mobilizing. A C-141 transport would fly them to Little Rock, then helicopters would take them to the site. Estimated arrival, 0800 hours the next morning, September 19th. By 2100 hours, 3 hours after the leak began, the situation was deteriorating. Sensors indicated toxic vapor had reached the top of the silo. The oxidizer tank, adjacent to the punctured fuel tank, showed signs of stress from the pressure changes and temperature fluctuations caused by the fuel leak. At 2200 hours, Air Force commanders made the decision to evacuate the surrounding area. The governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton, was notified. He authorized the evacuation of everyone within a 3-mile radius of the complex. Approximately 1,400 people from Damascus and surrounding farms were evacuated. They were told to leave immediately, taking nothing but essential items. Most assumed they would return in a few hours. Many would not see their homes for weeks. By 2300 hours, the evacuation was complete. A 3-mile radius around Complex 3747 was empty except for Air Force personnel at the command post. Inside the silo, 150 feet below ground, a Titan II missile slowly bled out its fuel, filling the confined space with explosive vapor, while a 9-megaton warhead sat atop the dying missile, held in place by mounting brackets designed for vertical stability, not horizontal stress. The night of September 18th and 19th, 1980 was a waiting game. The disaster response force was en route, the fuel was draining, the vapor concentration was increasing. Every hour that passed without an explosion increased the hope that the crisis would be resolved safely. At midnight, 6 hours after the socket fell, the fuel flow had decreased. The tank was approximately 60% drained. Pressure inside the tank had dropped to 25 psi. The leak rate had slowed to 200 gallons per minute. At 0100 hours on September 19th, the disaster response force arrived at Little Rock Air Force Base. They were briefed on the situation, loaded equipment, and prepared to deploy to the site. Estimated time to begin operations, ZO 300 hours. At ZO 200 hours, 8 hours after the initial puncture, the situation appeared to be stabilizing. The fuel flow had slowed further. Vapor sensors showed concentrations were high, but not increasing. The plan was for the disaster response force to enter the silo at first light, assess the damage, and begin warhead removal operations. At 02:45 hours, new readings from the silo showed a sudden spike in temperature. The cause was unclear. Possible explanations included friction from shifting missile components, exothermic chemical reactions between residual propellants, or stress-induced heating in overstressed metal structures. At 02:53 hours, the oxidizer tank, stressed by hours of pressure changes and temperature fluctuations, developed a crack. Nitrogen tetroxide began leaking into the silo, joining the Aerozine 50 vapor already present. For 9 hours, the silo had contained only fuel vapor and air, dangerous but not catastrophically so. Now, oxidizer was entering the space, hypergolic propellants. Contact meant ignition. At 02:55 hours, sensors in the silo went offline. The last reading showed temperature spiking to 300 degrees Fahrenheit. At 0300 hours, 58 seconds passed. The Aerozine 50 vapor mixed with nitrogen tetroxide vapor in sufficient concentrations to reach hypergolic ignition. The explosion was not nuclear. It was chemical, the combustion of 90,000 pounds of unburned Aerozine 50 reacting with escaped nitrogen tetroxide in a confined space. But the energy release was massive. The blast wave traveled up the silo at supersonic speed. The 740-ton silo door, designed to slide open during a launch, was blown off its rails and hurled 200 feet through the air. The door, the size of a small house, tumbled end over end before crashing into the Arkansas countryside. The missile, no longer held vertical by its mounting system, was launched by the explosion, not in a controlled manner, as designed, but violently, chaotically, driven by the blast pressure rather than engine thrust. The 103-foot-tall, 165-ton missile rose out of the silo, climbing approximately 100 feet before the structure began to break apart. The first stage separated from the second stage tumbled, and the nose cone, containing the W-53 9-megaton thermonuclear warhead, was thrown clear of the disintegrating missile. The warhead traveled in a ballistic arc, tumbling through the 3:00 a.m. darkness. It reached an apogee of approximately 600 feet above ground level before gravity reasserted control. The warhead fell, striking the ground in a field 600 feet from the silo. The impact should have been catastrophic. 9 megatons of thermonuclear yield, striking the Earth at terminal velocity. But the W-53 did not detonate. At the command post, 2,000 feet from the silo, personnel felt the shockwave. They saw the flash. They watched the fireball rise from the silo opening. And then, seconds later, they realized that the second explosion, the nuclear detonation they had feared, was not coming. Senior Airman David Powell, watching from the command post, later recalled, "I saw the flash and I thought, that's it, we're all dead. I waited for the nuclear blast. I waited for the light that would be the last thing I'd ever see. But it didn't come. The warhead didn't detonate. In the silo, the explosion had killed Senior Airman David Livingston, a member of the security team who had been in a nearby vehicle when the blast occurred. Livingston was the only fatality, but 21 other personnel were injured by the blast wave and flying debris. The search for the warhead began at first light on September 19th. The priority was locating the W-53 and determining its condition. A 9-megaton thermonuclear weapon was lying somewhere in the Arkansas countryside, possibly damaged, potentially unstable. At 06:15 hours, a search team located the warhead in a field 600 feet northeast of the silo. The weapon had impacted the ground at an angle, creating a shallow crater. The warhead's casing was dented but intact. There was no indication of a high explosive detonation, no plutonium contamination, no evidence that the warhead safety systems had failed. Nuclear weapons experts from the Department of Energy's emergency response team arrived at 0800 hours. They examined the warhead carefully, checking for damage to the physics package, the fissile core, and the safety systems. Their assessment: the warhead was damaged but stable. The safety systems had functioned as designed. Despite the violence of the explosion and the uncontrolled flight, the W-53 had not come close to detonating. The investigation into why the warhead survived intact revealed that the W-53 employed multiple safety mechanisms specifically designed to prevent accidental detonation. The primary safety was the absence of the neutron generators, critical components required for initiating the nuclear chain reaction, which were stored separately from the warhead during peacetime. Without these generators, the warhead could not achieve nuclear yield, even if its conventional explosives detonated. Additionally, the conventional explosives in the warhead used to compress the plutonium core were designed to be insensitive to shock and impact. The explosives were not triggered by the explosion in the silo or the impact with the ground because the electrical firing system had been disabled by the violence of the missile's breakup. But the most important factor was luck. The warhead had landed at an angle that distributed impact forces across the casing rather than concentrating them on a single point. If the warhead had hit nose first, the compression of internal components might have created conditions where a partial detonation was possible. The investigation report, completed months later, stated, "The W-53 warhead experienced stresses beyond its design parameters but did not detonate due to proper function of safety systems and fortuitous impact orientation." While a nuclear yield was never imminent, the possibility of a high explosive detonation releasing plutonium contamination was significant. The Damascus accident represents a serious nuclear weapons incident that could have resulted in substantial radiological contamination of a populated area. The timeline of what would have occurred if the warhead had achieved nuclear yield can be calculated from weapons effects data for a 9-megaton ground burst. Second 0. W-53 warhead detonates at ground level near Damascus, Arkansas, with a yield of 9 megatons. The fireball reaches a diameter of 3. miles and a temperature of 100 million degrees Celsius. Second 1. Thermal radiation ignites everything flammable within 35 miles. Little Rock, 50 miles south, experiences thermal flash sufficient to cause second-degree burns on exposed skin. Windows shatter across the city. Second 3. The blast wave expands at supersonic speed. At 10 miles distance, overpressure exceeds 20 ppi, sufficient to destroy all structures. Damascus and surrounding communities cease to exist. Casualties from blast effects within 10 miles, 100% fatality rate. Second 15, the fireball rises, creating a mushroom cloud that reaches an altitude of 90,000 feet. Radioactive debris is lifted into the stratosphere. The stem of the cloud is 5 miles wide. Minute 5, fallout begins descending downwind. Prevailing winds from the west carry radioactive material east toward Memphis, Tennessee, 140 miles away. The fallout plume extends 200 miles downwind. Minute 30. Heavy fallout is depositing across central Arkansas. Anyone outdoors receives lethal radiation doses within minutes. The plume has contaminated an area of approximately 5,000 square miles. Hour 2. Little Rock begins receiving significant fallout. The city's population of 180,000 is at risk. Emergency evacuation is impossible due to blocked roads, destroyed infrastructure, and radiation levels that make travel fatal. Hour 6. The fallout plume has reached Memphis. Radiation levels exceed 300 roentgens per hour, a lethal dose within hours of exposure. Memphis population, 650,000. Day 1. Immediate casualties from blast, thermal and prompt radiation effects within 20 miles. Approximately 25,000 dead. Fallout casualties beginning across central Arkansas and western Tennessee. Week 1. Fallout casualties increase as people exposed to high radiation doses begin dying. Estimates: additional 100,000 to 200,000 deaths from acute radiation syndrome. Month 1. Long-term contamination makes central Arkansas and parts of western Tennessee uninhabitable. Approximately 2 million people are displaced. Agricultural land is contaminated for decades. The Mississippi River, 60 miles from ground zero, is contaminated, affecting water supplies downstream for hundreds of miles. Year 1. Total deaths from the accidental detonation, approximately 250,000 to 400,000. Economic damage, immeasurable. A significant portion of Arkansas and Tennessee is a radioactive exclusion zone. The psychological impact of an accidental nuclear detonation on American soil would be catastrophic. This cascade of death and destruction would have resulted from an 8-pound socket wrench dropped during routine maintenance, not enemy action, not a deliberate launch, just an accident that escalated beyond all control. The Damascus accident forced a fundamental reassessment of the Titan II program. The investigation identified multiple contributing factors. Tool design. The socket wrench connection was a standard 3x4-inch drive that could separate under stress. No safety lanyard prevented drop tools from falling. Procedure inadequacy. The maintenance procedure did not require safety restraints for tools used over open spaces in the silo. Fuel tank vulnerability. The aluminum alloy fuel tanks were vulnerable to puncture from fallen objects. No protective barriers existed between work areas and tank surfaces. Response limitations. The 9-hour period between the puncture and the explosion demonstrated that once a catastrophic leak occurred, response options were extremely limited. Systemic age. By 1980, the Titan II missiles were 15–20 years old. Components were degrading. Maintenance requirements were increasing. The oxidizer tank that developed the final leak was stressed by years of corrosive oxidizer exposure. The broader context made the Damascus accident even more significant. The Titan II program had experienced numerous propellant-related accidents over its operational life. August 1965. Oxidizer leak at Complex 3734 near Searcy, Arkansas, killed 53 workers. January 1978. Oxidizer leak at Complex 533-7 near Rock, Kansas, resulted in major vapor release. Multiple minor leaks and component failures occurred annually across all 54 complexes. The Damascus accident was the worst, but it was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of systemic problems inherent in operating aging missiles with hypergolic propellants. In the aftermath of Damascus, the Department of Defense conducted a comprehensive review of the Titan II program. The findings were damning. The missiles were becoming too dangerous to operate. Maintenance costs were escalating. Newer solid-fuel missiles like the Minuteman III were more reliable and safer. On October 24, 1981, 13 months after the Damascus accident, Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger announced that all 54 Titan II missiles would be deactivated and removed from service. The phase-out began immediately and was completed by 1987. The Damascus silo itself was never repaired. The explosion had destroyed the launch facilities beyond economical repair. The site was decommissioned, the silo filled with gravel, and the land returned to agricultural use. Today, a small memorial marker stands near the location, one of the few physical reminders of how close Arkansas came to nuclear catastrophe. The crew members involved in the Damascus accident faced varying fates. Senior Airman David Powell, whose dropped socket initiated the crisis, was not charged with any offense. The investigation concluded that the accident resulted from inadequate procedures and tool design rather than individual negligence. Powell left the Air Force in 1982 and lived quietly, rarely speaking about the incident. Airman Jeffrey Plum, who was with Powell when the socket fell, continued in the Air Force and eventually retired after 20 years of service. He later stated in an interview, "I think about that night all the time. How close we came, how easily it could have been worse. An 8-pound wrench. That's all it took to nearly destroy half of Arkansas." The disaster response force members, who arrived just after the explosion, worked for weeks, securing the site and recovering the warhead. Several team members received commendations for their work in securing a damaged nuclear weapon under hazardous conditions. Lieutenant Colonel Dennis G. Bunch, who commanded the response operation, later wrote, "Damascus taught us that nuclear weapons are inherently dangerous, even in peacetime, even during routine operations. We got lucky." The warhead didn't detonate. The plutonium didn't contaminate the area, but it could have gone either way. The margin between safety and catastrophe was measured in millimeters of warhead casing integrity. The Damascus accident has been studied extensively as a case study in nuclear weapons safety and accident prevention. The consensus among experts is that the accident represented a near miss of historic proportions. Dr. Eric Schlosser, who investigated the Damascus accident for his book Command and Control, concluded, if that warhead had detonated, it would have been the worst accident in American history. A 9-megaton explosion in Arkansas would have killed hundreds of thousands of people and contaminated millions of acres, all because of an 8-pound wrench. The Air Force implemented numerous changes in response to Damascus. All tools used in missile silos required safety lanyards. Protective barriers were installed around vulnerable fuel tank areas. Enhanced leak detection systems were deployed. Response procedures were revised to enable faster warhead removal. Age limits were placed on propellant tank components. But the most significant change was the decision to phase out liquid fuel missiles entirely. Modern American ICBMs use solid fuel, which is stable, non-toxic, and does not leak. The Minuteman III missiles that replaced the Titan II can be maintained with minimal risk. An 8-pound wrench dropped in a Minuteman silo would damage equipment but would not create a catastrophic fuel leak. The statistics of what was prevented by the W-53's safety systems and favorable impact orientation are sobering. Date of incident, September 18, 1980. Initial event, socket wrench dropped at 18:52 hours. September 18th, explosion, ZO 300, 58 hours. September 19th, time from puncture to explosion 9 hours, 8 minutes, 58 seconds. Location, Complex 3747, Damascus, Arkansas. Missile, Titan II ICBM. Warhead, W-53 thermonuclear weapon, 9 megatons, wrench weight, 8 pounds, wrench cost, 47 50 fall distance, 70 feet fuel tank puncture, 2 inches diameter fuel leaked. 90,000 pounds evacuation radius, 3 miles. People evacuated. Device find 400 personnel killed. 1. Senior Airman David Livingston. Personnel injured. 21 warhead trajectory. 600 feet from silo warhead condition post-impact. Damaged but stable, no yield. If warhead had detonated, yield 9 megatons, 600 times Hiroshima. Fireball diameter 3. 2 miles blast radius, 5 psi overpressure. 20 miles thermal radiation, 3rd degree burns, 35 miles fallout contamination, 5,000 square miles, immediate deaths, 25,000 to 50,000 first-week deaths, radiation, 100,000 to 200,000, total deaths, 250,000 to 400,000 cities affected. Little Rock, destroyed or heavily damaged. Memphis, heavy contamination, multiple smaller communities destroyed. Long-term contamination, central Arkansas and western Tennessee uninhabitable for decades. The cost-benefit analysis is staggering. A 4750 tool dropped during routine maintenance came within safety margins of causing the largest accidental explosion in human history. The damage would have exceeded anything America experienced in war caused by an accident during peacetime operations. In 2010, on the 30th anniversary of the Damascus accident, a documentary titled Command and Control examined the incident in detail. Survivors and investigators were interviewed. The conclusion was unanimous. America was extraordinarily lucky. Former Secretary of Defense William Perry, who reviewed the Damascus investigation, stated, "We came very close to a catastrophic nuclear accident on American soil, closer than the public realized at the time. The Damascus accident should serve as a permanent reminder that nuclear weapons are inherently dangerous, even when they're not being used in war. We must never become complacent about nuclear safety." The Damascus silo site today is farmland. The crater left by the explosion has been filled. Crops grow where a Titan II missile once stood. Nothing visible remains except a historical marker noting that a missile complex once occupied the site. But 150 feet below the surface, embedded in the concrete and rock, are remnants of the explosion. Pieces of the missile, fragments of the fuel tanks, evidence of the night when an 8-pound wrench fell and nearly changed history. On September 18, 1980, at 18:52 hours, Air Force technician Senior Airman David Powell was performing routine maintenance on a Titan II missile. He was using an 8-pound socket wrench. The wrench slipped from his hand, fell 70 feet, and punctured the missile's fuel tank. 9 hours later, the missile exploded, throwing a 9-megaton thermonuclear warhead 600 feet through the air. The warhead did not detonate. America did not lose half of Arkansas to nuclear fire. Hundreds of thousands of people lived because the W-53's safety systems worked as designed, and the warhead hit the ground at an angle that distributed impact forces favorably. But it could have been different. The warhead could have hit nose first. The safety systems could have failed. The conventional explosives could have detonated, spreading plutonium across Arkansas. Or in the worst case, the physics package could have achieved criticality, and 9 megatons of thermonuclear yield could have detonated 50 miles from Little Rock. An Air Force technician dropped an 8-pound wrench in a missile silo, nearly vaporizing half of Arkansas. One tool, one mistake, one chain of events that cascaded from routine maintenance to catastrophic explosion in 9 hours. The Damascus accident proved that nuclear weapons in peacetime can be as dangerous as nuclear weapons in war. Not from enemy action, not from deliberate launch, but from human error, mechanical failure, and the fundamental volatility of systems designed to deliver megatons of destructive power. The wrench cost $47.50. The lesson it taught was priceless. Nuclear weapons are never truly safe. We can only make them safer, implement better procedures, improve safety systems, and pray that when the next accident occurs, we'll be as lucky as we were at Damascus, Arkansas, on September 19, 1980. The Air Force technician dropped an 8-pound wrench, and for 9 hours, Arkansas waited to see if it would survive. The answer came at 0300 hours. Explosion, yes. Nuclear detonation, no. Catastrophe averted. Lesson learned. Memorial built. And beneath the Arkansas farmland, pieces of a Titan II missile remain buried, forever marking the spot where an 8-pound tool nearly vaporized half a state.